Kia ora, ngā mahina nui ki a koutou katoa I hui mai nei tēnei pōtino a tāhua. Ki te mihi tuatahi ki te mana whenua o te rohi a Tāmaki Makaurau. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Ki ngā rangatira o te Waipapa Tau Matarau, Dawn Freshwood, Te Kauiho Hoskings, Juliet Gerard, our friend Susie Wilds. Tēnā koe, ngā rangatira, piki mai, kaki mai. Ki ngā mātua o te whānau a Professor Cate, kei hea tō mātua. Oh my gosh, ānei. Nau mai, hara mai ki te Aotearoa, ki tō whānau, tō tāne mea tōna tamariki, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Heoi anō. Ki ngā tangata katoa I hui mai nei, whakarongo mai. Wānanga tia, kia mau te mōhiotanga koutou mō te kōrero a Professor Cate Macinnis-Ng. Heoi anō, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Mauri oho, mauri tū, mauri ora ki a tātou. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā hau e whā, tēnā koutou. Nau mai haere mai ki te whare pūtaiao. A koana te ngākau, kua tai mai koutou ki te whakanui, I te kaupapa o te rā, I te ahorangi o te rā. Ara, Cate Macinnis-Ng, nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ko Jan Lindsay tōku ingoa. My name is Jan Lindsay. I am the Associate Dean Research in Te Whare Pūtau, the Faculty of Science, here at Waipapa Tau Matarau, the University of Auckland. I'd like to welcome you all today. I'd like to thank Tara for beginning us this evening with a lovely mihi. And yes, welcome everybody to the inaugural lecture of Cate Macinnis-Ng, Professor in Ecology at Waipapa Tau Matarau, the University of Auckland, and awesome advocate for women in science. Cate grew up in Sydney, in Australia. She has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Biology and has studied the impacts of pollutants on seagrass health for her PhD. For her first postdoc, Cate moved on to terrestrial plants and developed an interest in plant-water relations, which remains a central part of her research program. Like many of us working mothers, Cate spent many years on fixed-term contracts, it's a familiar story, whilst caring for her children. In 2010, she moved to Tāmaki Makaurau with her family and joined the University of Auckland. She has received several prestigious grants in her career, including a Marsden Fast Start grant and a Rutherford Discovery Fellowship. In 2015, she secured an ongoing full-time position in the School of Biological Sciences here at the university. Cate has received a range of awards during her career, including a University of Auckland Early Career Research Excellence Award, the Roger Slack Award for Plant Science Research, and the Miriam Dell Award for Mentoring. This is for outstanding mentoring efforts to retain females in science, mathematics, or technology. Cate has served as president of the New Zealand Ecological Society, as council member for the Royal Society Te Aparangi, and as academic group leader for the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology group in the School of Biological Sciences. She is currently the senior editor for the Journal of Applied Ecology. We're not studying plants and the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. In Aotearoa, Cate enjoys spending time with her husband and teenage children, who I believe are all here tonight, and preferably in the outdoors or in the water. Now, getting to the level of professor is no mean feat. Achieving the level of professor requires someone to be excellent in research, in teaching, and service. So it is testament to the efforts and the hard work that Cate has put in that she has achieved this level in her career. Cate will be talking to us tonight about her research on plants, but also about her journey, in particular the resilience and perseverance needed to sustain a career in science as a woman and as a mother. So I'll hand over to you now, Kate. Let's welcome Kate.
Kia ora koutou. Good evening, everyone. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thanks so much to each and every one of you for being here this evening. I really appreciate you all being here. But special thanks to Tara for joining us from Wellington, and thank you for the lovely introduction. And also I want to point out my parents, Chris and Peter, who've joined us from Sydney tonight. So thanks for coming, Mum and Dad. So as it's already been alluded to, I'm going to tell you a bit about my career progress and a little bit about some plants. So join me for a bit of a wander in the forest, and I promise some trees along the way and some other bits and pieces. So I was very fortunate to grow up surrounded by the landscapes, seascapes and vegetation of what's now known as Sydney. I'm grateful to the Gayamigal clan of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the land that is in the area that's now known as Manly. I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, for what always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I was always inspired by the landscapes around me, and at the age of 6, I produced this masterpiece of mixed media, which actually then won me second place in the Greening of Balgowlah competition. I recall winning a packet of texters, and they were such a prized possession that I didn't want to open them. And then when I finally did get round to opening them, maybe even a year later, they'd all dried up, so I couldn't actually use them. But the green idea has stuck with me for a lifetime, I think. And these are my two brothers. Angus is my older brother, and Duncan is my younger brother. I went to North Sydney Girls High School, which is a selective school. We don't have those here, and I think that might be a good thing. I recall that the year that I went, they'd opened up the boundary, so something like 2,000 girls applied for 120 positions. So it was a bit of a pressure cooker environment to grow up in. But one benefit of that, I think, is that I don't get imposter syndrome very often, although maybe tonight is an exception. I achieved lots of bits and pieces, did particularly well in science, probably to the delight of my parents, who were both science teachers. So science was a real focus for me, but I did have some other things going on. I was doing things like brownies, and I also did ballet and water polo into my teenage years, until my ballet teacher told me that my arms were getting too bulky from water polo and I should give up water polo. So in fact, the very next week I gave up ballet and stuck with the water polo. And it's the swimming that I still do and not the ballet, because the ballet stuffed my hips. But anyway, that's a life lesson I learned a bit too late. So looking back on my reports from school, in those days it was a little folder with slips that all the teachers would write in. This is from my second last year of school for my biology grade, and you can see the bottom here, the cumulative assessment. This is our rank. So I went from third to second with a score of 99. You can't imagine how frustrating it was to get 99 and only be placed second. But by the end of the year and the end of my schooling, I'd reached first place in biology. Very much thanks to Mum for helping me. I remember Mum writing practice exam questions and Mum giving me feedback and me going back and trying again. So I really appreciate the support that I've had from my parents throughout my career. So this ended up with me achieving the certificate, Kimberley Prize in Biology it was called, and I also came 5th in the state in biology. And I think there was about 16,000 kids doing biology that year in New South Wales, so biology was obviously my calling. And so it's probably not a surprise that I went on to study Bachelor of Science in Biology. But before I go on to that, yes, it was really interesting looking through my reports, and this phrase, very pleasing, came up very often. And so it would be very pleasing results, very pleasing things, very pleasing outcomes. I was constantly very pleasing. It was kind of alarming going through all the years of how pleasing I was. But as you might, those of you who know me well will know that I'm not really into being pleasing anymore. So let's get rid of that. And in fact, yeah, I think it's kind of stunning that very pleasing might be something that we should want young women to be. So, studying my Bachelor of Science in Environmental Biology at the University of Technology, Sydney, obviously learnt all about Australian landscapes and vegetation. And we had kind of a capstone course, which was the third year field trip, and that would rotate going to different locations. But for my year, it was the Great Western, so it was the semi-arid ecology field trip. We spent 3 weeks in Western New South Wales, travelling all the way out to Cameron Corner, which is where New South Wales, Queensland and South Australia come together. It's very arid, very dry, and not wet at all. But this is the group of us in the bus, and one of the funny stories is that they had to use a different bus company after we'd been all sitting in it for 3 weeks. It wasn't a very pleasant place to be after all that amount of time. It's a good thing it was winter time and not too hot, because otherwise, it would have been even worse. But from my recollection, this is the only time we had Indigenous tuition during my time at university. And this is something that I hope is changing. I was delighted though when our family archivist Brianna found this photograph of me graduating with my 2 grandmothers. So that was a cool photo to find. So when I finished my undergraduate, I decided to do an honours, and I really wanted to work on frogs because they're green. And there was nobody with that expertise at the university I was at. So I found that seaweeds had a similar colour palette and also a similar slimy feel. So I ended up working on Neptune's necklace, which is also found here in Aotearoa. So Homicera banksii has really variable forms, and I did a big field trip around the coast of New South Wales and Victoria. And then later into South Australia, and one of my supervisors went down to Tasmania to do some measurements there. We really should have included some data from New Zealand as well, but in any case, if you're interested in that, you can take a look at the paper. Then moving on to my PhD, I moved on to seagrasses, and I looked at the effects of different pollutants on their health. So I predominantly worked at this beach here, which is called Paradise Beach in Pittwater. It's a very nice place to do field work. And the seagrasses there were doing very well, but I was doing some experiments to see what the effects of different pollutants would be. So this is the graduation photograph, and this is my supervisor, Peter Ralph, from the University of Technology, Sydney. So the setup was that I put these chambers out in the seagrass meadows, and I had various kind of clamps and things to put on them. And so the leaves were kind of held in place, and then I could use an instrument to measure their photosynthesis from outside the chambers. And then I also did similar experiments in the lab to confirm what we were finding in the field. Now I've dug up this this animation from my PhD presentation in 2022, and this is the height of animations, the height of sophistication of animations 22 years ago. So it was in 2002. So these are the different chambers, and I had high treatment, low treatment, and also some controls which were in the chambers, and also some external controls. And here comes me to take the measurements. So I managed to produce 5 papers and a book chapter out of my PhD work, and it's amounted to 750 citations, which I'm pretty proud of. But at that time, there wasn't much money in seagrasses, so I wasn't able to find a position to continue on in that space. But fortunately, Derek Emis was a professor at the university I was at, and he came along to my final PhD talk and was impressed by the animation and in fact the talk itself, and so offered me a job to work with him on land plants. And so this offered a further opportunity for dodgy animations. I did actually take the animation out because it was really laboured, but I just thought this was great how somehow we've ended up with some carrots. These are meant to be trees. So thank goodness for professionals to do these things for us now. But this work was looking at all about plant-water relations, so understanding how plants manage water availability under different seasons, I guess is how I could best explain it briefly. There's a whole lot more to it, but I'm not sure many in this audience would be super enthused about it. But working with Derek was fantastic. He's a really good writer, and I learnt lots from him about research and the writing process. And I've been in touch with him in the last week, and he told me to let everyone know he's got a new book coming out, and I'm sure it will be great because he is a really good writer. So it will be available on Amazon, and he hasn't yet promised me any royalties for this, but do get into it if you're interested in this kind of thing. So after that period, I went on to work with Derek for a total of 7 years, and we did lots of work looking at forest hydrology in the Sydney region predominantly, but also systems all around Australia. We were using measurement and modelling approaches, and it was a big group of postdocs and PhD students. It was a really intellectually stimulating time for me because I learnt lots of different techniques, which were both kind of field-based, doing field work, and also working with modelling approaches. And the team was fantastic. I worked with all sorts of great people, and you can see resulted in a lot of outputs. So I think by that point, I'd pretty much established myself as remaining on land, and I obviously haven't gone back to the seagrasses. But while that was going on, there was also life happening. And so this timeline sort of represents a bit more about what was going on in life beyond just the career. So I started my first postdoc in 2022, and it was a 2-year project. And what I've got here is sort of the timeline all the way through to professor. So I was awarded my PhD in May 2003, and during that time, when I was in the postdoc. So the postdoc position I actually started the week after I'd submitted my PhD. It's not something that I recommend. It was pretty exhausting. But in any case, I decided I'd get myself into something a bit more time-consuming, which is having kids. So in December 2004, our first child, Callum, was born. So not all of you know, but this is Callum, and we like to remember him in the happy and healthy times, but he was born with a rare blood disorder known as Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome. So I had to stop work and spend my time looking after him, but unfortunately the condition that he had was so severe that he had a spontaneous brain bleed when he was 16 months old and died in hospital. So that was a big thing. That was something that you never expect in life, and you never come to feel like it's something usual. And we obviously miss him every day, but he would have been 20 in December. So in that light blue period, I was caring for Callum, but then a year after Callum died, Brianna joined us, and then in 2 years after that, Alistair joined us. So Brianna looks like she's not pleased with that photograph, but it was my choice. Then in 2010, we got the opportunity to move here to Aotearoa. So Julian and I had our honeymoon here in 2000, so it seemed like a bit of a sign when he got offered to come to New Zealand for work. So it was something that we kind of couldn't turn down, and we packed up our lives and moved over the ditch. Even though I just started a really good postdoc, a 3-year-long position, which was quite rare, I was only 6 months into it, but we thought this was going to be a bit of an adventure. So by that time, by 2010, I had my arms full with these two, but also I had my heart full because Brianna and Alistair are just amazing kids, and I think there's nothing like being a bereaved parent to really understand and feel the joy of happy, healthy kids. So Brianna and Alistair, I love you too. It was a bit nuts sometimes though, in fact, very often. I don't know where he got that from, or perhaps this explains it. But in amongst all of that shenanigans, I was trying to build a serious career. And so back to the timeline, it took me a while to sort of settle in here, and then I started doing some fixed-term contracts in teaching and other sorts of activities. First of all in the School of Environment, and then I moved into SBS in 2015. And as Jan's just told us, I did manage to win a few bits and pieces along the way, and I think I really felt like I had to achieve to be able to be taken seriously as a parent. I was working part-time for much of that career, and there's always this stigma that if you're working part-time you're not serious about your research or about your career. But that wasn't me, obviously. I managed to achieve lots of different things, but not all by myself. I do want to just briefly say too that I've had a whole lot of, all of these red marks are surgeries that I've had, including an ectopic pregnancy before Callum was born. So I would not be here if it weren't for modern medicine. So it's been a bit of a ride, right, Julian? So managing to do all of that, I have so many friends and family and colleagues and collaborators and students to thank, but I do want to single out a few people. Obviously, Julian's number one. I couldn't imagine doing this with anybody else, and I think my second best decision in life was to marry you, and the first best decision was to ask you out. So thank you for all that you do for me. I love you. And then, of course, my parents, mum and dad. So my parents have come across to Auckland every school holidays, pretty much, until my younger brother had twins, and Brianna and Alistair were no longer the favourite grandchildren. But in any case, really appreciate mum and dad with all the support, not just looking after the kids, but the encouragement and the enthusiasm for my career as well. I also want to acknowledge my wonderful mother-in-law. There's a bit of a language barrier, and I think she thinks it's kind of nuts that I'm a doctor of trees. It seems a bit useless, but she's always very welcoming and makes the best food, so I feel very lucky to have her. And then when it comes to friends, I want to single out Susie Wiles as a wonderful friend. So Susie and I met in 2012 when we were doing the Women in Leadership program together. And we've been firm friends since. Susie, as many will know, is an incredible person and is just the absolute best friend one could have. So not everyone would know, though, that Susie and I together applied for our promotion to Professor, and we worked together on what we were submitting. And it's very clear that Susie is a highly accomplished researcher. She's an outstanding teacher. And of course, everybody knows that she's kind of good at science communication. But having seen what Susie submitted, I was absolutely astounded to find out that her promotion application did not progress to the international review stage. Could it be because she took the university to court? I don't know, it's not for me to say. But she went on and won that, so there's something in it. But Susie, thank you so much for all you are. I feel so blessed to call you as a friend, and keep doing you. And I'd also like to thank a few mentors. I think I've already mentioned Derek, who's somebody who was just really incredible in how he supported me. So Derek and his wonderful wife, Deb, came to Callum's funeral, and he said they stayed till the end, actually. There was lots of people there. He stayed to the end, and he said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And I said, "I need a job," because I didn't have a job, and the thought of being at home with no child to look after and no job to go to was just too difficult. So a couple of weeks later, I was back at work, just working 2 days a week, and doing the job that I'd kind of been doing previously. But Derek didn't treat me as a basket case. He didn't treat me as some kind of charity. He expected me to deliver, and that was actually exactly what I needed. To feel like I could be useful and that I could deliver was a really important thing to me. Around that time, I also want to acknowledge Tally Palmer, who was a professor at the time at UTS as well. And Tally is an extraordinary woman, just so generous in her time and the way she shares things. And so I've been in touch with her in the last few weeks as well. She's recently retired. She's back in South Africa now. But she was sharing some memories that we had together, probably not appropriate for sharing here, but I feel very blessed to have had her in my life. And I think these are two of the people that I really model my own mentoring on, so I feel very grateful to have worked with them. I also want to acknowledge Jacqueline Beggs, who's here in the room, who has been a fabulous mentor and supporter and cheerleader too. So thank you for all that you've done, Jacqueline. Again, probably some stories that I could tell, but I won't. And finally, I want to acknowledge my good friend Tim Curran. And I think Tim's somebody who just always makes you be always true to your values. So Tim's at Lincoln University, and I'd call him more a peer-to-peer mentor, and I think that happens more as we progress through our careers. We become mentors for those around us as much as we are for people at different career stages. So yeah, Tim couldn't be here tonight, but I wanted to acknowledge him. And the last person I want to acknowledge is Vera Russell, who is a grief counsellor at the Centre for Children's Cancer and Blood Disorders. Vera is a very private person, so I don't have a photo of her, and I also couldn't find one online. But I did 10 years of grief counselling, and Vera was just an extraordinary person for that. And I wanted to acknowledge her because we should normalise the counselling or therapy when we need those things. But also because she's amazing. Okay, so back to my timeline then. All of these blue points here are points where I could have popped out in the sense that I had contracts finishing and I was madly trying to get the next thing. Okay, so 13 years of fixed term contracts, there's a lot of points where I could have ended up not staying in the program. And I've acknowledged a few people who helped me get through at some of those points. There's actually lots of people who've kind of helped, but actually probably it was mostly just down to Julian going, okay, we'll just keep trying sort of thing, because Julian works in a different industry and it just kind of doesn't really make sense. Sometimes he'd say, why are you still working when you're not getting paid? Shouldn't the university be paying you? And I'd be like, well, I'm between contracts. So the kind of, getting through was something that it only kind of became apparent that it would work when it did actually work out, if that makes sense. And anyhow, in 2015, I was awarded a Rutherford Discovery Fellowship, and from that I was able to negotiate a permanent role. But I asked for this permanent role based on a colleague who was in the same faculty, had received the same fellowship the year before, and he had virtually been ushered into a permanent position. He'd been around for a while on fixed-term contracts, and he was into a permanent position. So the following year when I won mine, I kind of said, I want what he got, and I was told no. So it took me 9 months of negotiations to get that to come through. I had to go to a different university, and in fact I'm quite lucky because there were 7 of the 10 fellowships went to our university that year, and so this is the advertisement that the university put in the newspaper. And in fact, it would have been a bit embarrassing if one of those fellows had then nipped off elsewhere because she wasn't properly supported. So that was something that kind of helped me out a bit, I think. There's been a few things like that, though, where I've had to really advocate for myself. And I think that kind of stuff toughens you up, but it's not fun to go through. So there's lots of barriers. I've shared a lot of the barriers that I've had to deal with. Let's have a look at the literature. So women academics are rated lower in student evaluations. If publishing with men, the male author gets given the credit. Women go for promotion at a slower rate, and this is not necessarily because women are not achieving. It's often because women are told, oh, you're probably not quite ready. So the process for going for promotion to professor involves going to the dean, and the dean kind of says whether, in that time it was he, thank goodness we've got Sarah Young here now. The dean at the time said to me, oh, maybe you should wait a year. And I was like, no, last year was my waiting year. I'm going this year. And I spoke to him in that conversation about how, he should be thinking about what it might be like for women. And he said, oh, I understand. I understand what it's like for women in science. I am a computer scientist. And I said, how is that relevant? And he said, well, as computer scientists, our outputs are in they're not in normal publications, they are in these conference proceedings. And so, people don't understand. And I said, oh, okay, what's happened? And he said, oh, well, we've just explained to people that we can count the conference proceedings as publications and it's all fine. And so I said to him, and did this slow down your career progress at all? And he said, no. And I said, I think it might be a little bit different, but I couldn't go into it too much because I was needing to seek his support for my promotion application. So it was a really kind of difficult conversation where I had to absolutely hold my tongue, which is not what I usually do, but thankfully it's worked out all right in the end. And delighted to no longer have mansplaining, and welcome Sarah, our new dean. So women can be competent or likeable, but never both. And so this literature plays out really clearly that if you're a woman who knows what you're doing, well then you're obviously not a likeable woman, are you? And if you're a likeable woman, then you don't really know what you're doing. So that can be fun. The pastoral care burden that's placed on women is way greater than what's placed on men. And I want to say too that as a white woman, I obviously don't have the cultural burden. So we know about the cultural double shift where here in Aotearoa, Māori and Pacifica academics have this additional burden of the cultural things that they need to be contributing, or they're expected to contribute. And none of that stuff, as much work as it is, none of it is in the documents for promotion application. The chilly climate of academia, and this is something that's kind of well known in the literature, and an example of this is that women are more likely to be harassed and intimidated. And a lot of these barriers are not just in academia, there can be across different types of workplaces as well. And then the last one here, for all of those points, none of them I've said anything about parenting. In fact, a lot of the barriers are nothing to do with being a parent. But the parenting sort of adds an additional layer to it. And so there's this concept of the motherhood penalty versus the fatherhood bonus, where fathers are seen as being competent and capable and likeable, whereas mothers are spending their time away from the workplace and they're expected to be doing the homework. So an example of this is a former head of school when I was working in the School of Environment. He thought he was being nice, and every time I saw him, he'd ask me how the kids were. And finally I said to him, "Yep, they're good, thanks, but have you asked," so a colleague had similar age children. I said, "Have you asked my male colleague how his kids are?" And he said, "No, why would I do that?" And I said, "Well, why are you asking me then?" Because when I was in the workplace, I wanted to be about doing my work. And I think he was a bit taken aback, but about a year later, he said, yeah, I understood what you said, in the sense that somebody can be more than, they can be both a mother and a worker. They don't have to be just a mother all the time. Okay, so then all of this plays out into the statistics that we see around the gender distribution. So this is from a paper that Leilani Walker led, and we looked at data. We only had data from 2012 to 2017, so each panel is a separate year of data, but as you go from left to right on these panels, they get more senior. So the women are in orange, and you can see consistently women drop off below that 50% dotted line. Okay, so we see lots of women in the lower ranks, and that is dropping off. And the really interesting thing is that this pattern was seen in the 80s, and we were told, oh, you just have to give it time. But in fact, time is not making that difference that we'd expect that it should. So in the analysis that we did, we looked at what that pattern was over the data set that we had. And you can see here that it flattens off, and that was super depressing. And so if we went with that curve, then it was never going to reach parity. So we said, okay, let's just hope that that little blip there is off course, and if we force a straight line through it, we estimated that it'll be about 10 years. In about 10 years' time, we'll have parity for men and women in full-time academic roles in New Zealand's, in universities in Aotearoa. Time will tell. I mean, we've got a few more years of data to add on to that, so maybe we should think about doing that again. So let's look at solutions. I think it's a useful thing to do. First of all, let's fix the system. We've got to be very clear that it's not women who are broken, it's in fact the system that's broken, and that's something that Susie often says. Women are not broken. And it's not just women, is it? It's all the different kinds of types of marginalisation and diversity. So the system itself, fixing that is going to be a big job. Let's think about some other stuff we can do around that. A lot of what I've done is around challenging institutional norms. So being told that, oh, you don't fit the system, Kate, well, I just go ahead and do it anyway. Let's do more of that, because the more we do things differently, the more those different things will be accepted. We should normalise non-traditional career pathways. So me showing you what my pathway looked like is not about me wanting to, self-indulge. It's about me saying, here's a pathway that works. There are lots of different pathways that work. It's not just one kind of pathway. Another thing I would say too is talking about Callum is a really difficult thing, but I think it's important that we do that because we have lives happening outside of work. I remember shortly after Callum died, there was a woman who didn't have children, and I know she was well-meaning, but she said to me, oh, you shouldn't talk about Callum, and you shouldn't put it in any applications, you shouldn't put it on your CV, because it looks like you're just trying to get sympathy. And I didn't have the space at that time to say, well, if I wanted sympathy, I've got my family and I've got my bereaved mothers group to go to. I was never trying to get sympathy, but it is about saying, there's different things going on in our lives. And now I find that when I share it, particularly with students and early career researchers, many will come up to me afterwards and say, thank you for sharing something that makes me feel like I can achieve too. We don't need to be absolutely perfect, and our lives don't need to be perfect for us to be successful in our careers. I think we need to adopt a position of intellectual humility. Okay, so that's understanding what the limits of our own knowledge are and being open to other ideas and wanting to hear from others and not just be those speaking ourselves, which is kind of ironic when I've, become a professor and I'm here talking at you all. And that's something that I do try to do in my own life, is to be intellectually humble, and humble in other ways too. And I also think we should challenge the notion of excellence. So how we define excellence is very biased towards a particular demographic group. There is not just one type of excellence, there are so many types of excellence. Let's think about all of those. I want to acknowledge Mel Zeppel, who's somebody who was involved in my career early on. This was a really great solution for us and an example of being creative around sort of keeping the career going. So when Mel and I were postdocing together, just coincidentally, we didn't actually plan it, but our kids kind of, I guess it's jumped over each other. So when she was on parental leave, I was at work, and then she got pregnant, and then we'd switch over. So we managed to really manage our kind of career together, which was a really successful thing for both of us. So our kids are kind of spaced in amongst each other, which is nice. If you want more solutions, I've written a paper on this, addressing gender inequalities in forest science and research. And there's solutions for all sorts of different people and what they should be doing. So everyone, there's no excuse for not being part of the solution. And I want to really highlight the importance of working with diverse collaborators. It's so easy for us in academia to just surround ourselves with people like ourselves, but working with diverse collaborators gives us the opportunity to understand different perspectives. And I really learnt this when I was working with Tara McAllister as a postdoc funded by Te Pūnaha Matatini and the Vision Mātauranga Capability Fund. So Tara is a highly accomplished freshwater ecologist, but many will best know her for her work on Why Isn't My Professor Māori? So she's done all this work to expose and highlight the, I guess it's the imbalance in academia. So working with Tara, I really refined the idea of making space and not taking up space. So how do we make sure that people other than ourselves have the platforms? I think in academia we're used to kind of big noting ourselves, it's how we get ahead, right? But we need to be making space for others, making sure that the people who are not at the table have space at the table and that they are heard at the table. Tara's also taught me about the idea of being a good visitor, which I've found really helpful in terms of being a, I guess I like to be a Pākehā ally and just thinking about different spaces and how to be active in a really constructive way in those. One of Tara's contributions has been 50 reasons why there are no Māori in your science department, and I know a lot of people found this quite challenging when it first came out, because many people shared it with me that they found it upsetting. And it's true, it is upsetting. But I think the important thing to remember is that Tara is not the one that's made it upsetting. She's not the one doing these things. She's just highlighting them and shining the light on them and telling us that it's all going on. So what I do is kind of take a look at that every so often. It's not a nice document to look at, but it's important that we keep reminding ourselves that these things are still going on. There's lots of inappropriate things happening, and we need to be doing the work to address that. So I encourage everyone to look at those things, to be getting used to being uncomfortable, and to try and be active in the space to address that. Because no matter how uncomfortable it is for me as a white woman to read that, I can guarantee it's way more uncomfortable for Tara to experience those things and then to have to write about them. Now, challenging institutional norms, sometimes they can be sort of seemingly quite small things, and this is an example of something that I did. So in 2014, I missed out on the Rutherford Discovery Fellowship, and I thought I was going to have to leave research because I didn't have any other options to go to. Fortunately, Jacqueline came through with a position in SBS, and that's when I moved to biology. But I thought I wanted to go for this Rutherford Fellowship again, and I realised that in accounting for like my time since PhD, I hadn't taken into account my part-time periods. So I created this spreadsheet, which you can use to put in all of your information about when you've been working and when it's part-time and stuff, and then it tells you whether you might be eligible or not for the particular fellowships. So it's used for fast starts and also for the new fellowship programs that the Royal Society Te Aoparangi has. And what I love is when people come up to me and say, I used your calculator, and it makes me so happy. So it's a somewhat small thing, but I think these kinds of things can make a difference to people's lives. And then the last thing I want to talk about here is getting into something quite dark, I guess. This is the pyramid model of gender-based violence. And I presented this at I was invited to speak at a Women in Forest symposium in Viterbo in Italy in July. And I said to the lady organising the symposium, I said, do you want to see my slides before I speak? Because I knew I was being a little bit, I guess strong, maybe is the word. And she said, oh, no, I trust you. But I think actually she may have wished she saw my slides. Because what happened was I talked about how we absolutely need to be addressing inequality and disadvantages and power differences at the very base here, because that's what supports perpetrators. Okay, so it's not just about, well, it would be nice if we were nice to each other. It's about, it's essential that we're looking at these things to prevent violence and the other things that happen in the workplace. And it was so interesting at this symposium because I put up at the beginning some photographs of me climbing trees, this photo in particular, and one of the students said to me, oh, you can climb trees? And I said, yeah. And she said, oh, in our study, only the boys are allowed to learn to climb trees. You can imagine I was infuriated on her behalf and asked for some more details. And I think actually she was really glad to have the opportunity to talk about it openly. And so she explained to me the fact that, yeah, when it came time to do the tree climbing training, the girls were all told to, shuffle off elsewhere kind of thing. And it was potentially limiting their career opportunities because they weren't able to gain this skill. So I don't know, I've caused all sorts of trouble and I haven't heard back from the people initially. But in any case, I think it's really important that we say these things and I don't regret it at all. Okay, so I promised some trees. Let's get back to the trees. So if we go back to 2010 when we moved here, I was looking for sort of, I guess, an idea for research. And Kauri, being the largest and longest lived species in Aotearoa, seemed like a good species to work on. It's known that they're quite responsive to climatic conditions, and the tree ring record shows that they have a good response to the El Nino Southern Oscillation pattern. But the nature of that response is a little bit counterintuitive from a physiological perspective. So I thought that was a nice place to sort of start doing some research to understand the physiology of these trees. So Kauri, of course, highly culturally significant and really important for biodiversity. This is a photograph of the canopy of Tāne Mahuta, the largest living kauri, and there's something like 46 species of epiphytes live in the canopy, so they're immensely important for biodiversity. So I started working on water fluxes of the kauri forest, doing all sorts of measurements, basically transferring some of the skills that I'd learnt in Sydney over here, and got a Marsden Fast Start to work on that, just looking at the kind of processes of water use of kauri and how they changed seasonally and under different conditions. And then we also looked at the carbon fluxes of the kauri forests together with that. But all of this work was really just looking at the ambient conditions and understanding how kauri worked as the conditions were. In 2015, when I got the Rutherford Discovery Fellowship, we were able to look at actually creating kind of a manipulative experiment in the forest. So the kauri drought experiment was a 5-year project looking at kauri performance under dry conditions, and this is PhD student Ben Cranston who did a lot of the work. So this is what it looks like. We basically put skirts on trees to dry out the soil below those trees, and then we put lots of sensors on the tree to try and work out what was happening. So we did lots of tree climbing, lots of measurements, lots of work in the forest. So we're very lucky to have the Huapai Scientific Reserve as a resource at the university. So these are just some photographs from our setup day in 2017 when we were doing the main setup. Lots of gear, lots of figuring things out, and we worked with professional tree climbers to help us do the installations. I'm grateful to have Arno, who's a photographer with the New Zealand Geographic, there on the day to capture it for us. A lot of planning, making sure we've got everything right, got all the bits and pieces that we need. This kind of field work's super challenging. And the thing was, working with the professional climbers, they were kind of looking after the safety for us and the getting into the trees, and then we would have to look after the sensors and what we needed to do to get those installed. So we've had a number of papers come out from this so far, but it's definitely watch this space because we've got a whole lot more to come. And the data set that we collected is really rich, so I expect to be working on it with students for a number of years to come. But I do want to just show you that I have just one slide of data from that. I could spend way more time talking about this, but I think this audience might prefer not too much of the data. So this is just showing that the trees that we put the skirts on actually had some signs of acclimation to the dry conditions when the natural drought happened. So I don't know if everyone remembers, but when we went into lockdown in 2020, there was actually a drought happening in the forests across Aotearoa. So it was deeply frustrating as a drought researcher to have a drought happening and we couldn't go out there and measure it. But fortunately, a lot of our sensors were still operating, so we did manage to get some good data. So this figure here shows the tree water deficit. And so the more a line goes down, the more deficit there is. And each one of these, this is sort of a number of days across the month here. So you can see that there's a cycle of day and night as that tree water deficit changes. So if we go from December, January, February, March, you can see that the water deficit develops across the summer. So it gets worse as summer progresses. And then if we compare sort of the 2018 to 2019 summer to the 2019 to 2020 summer, you can see there's a lot more water deficit. And it developed earlier in the 2020 February compared to February 2019. But what we can see too is these black and red lines. So the red lines are the trees that had the skirts on them, and the black lines are the ones that didn't have the skirts. And in general, what we found is that those trees without the skirts that hadn't been exposed to that mild drought were developing much greater tree water deficit during that severe drought period. So this is a good sign for Cate and suggests that they can acclimate to drier soils. So if the climatic changes are kind of slow enough and gentle enough, then potentially the trees have good water saving strategies. And we also found that the amount of water used from the stem increased for those droughted trees. So each one of these bars here is either a seasonal average for drought or control trees. And in all the different seasons for years 2 and 3, you can see that the red ones are higher than the grey ones. And this just demonstrates that the droughted trees are using more water from their stored water within their stem. So Cate have got massive stems and really deep sapwood. It's quite unusual, the sort of depth of sapwood and the amount of water that they store in them. But it shows that that's quite important during dry times. So having that stem water store is really useful for Cate during drought. So essentially we found some really good and interesting news, but I'll move on from that. So this is sort of just showing what's coming out of that work, and I think it might take me a while to get through it all. It's a very detailed data set. So this is kind of the work that Ben did in the middle here, and a number of different projects have sort of used the data to interpret it in other ways, compare it to other kinds of systems, and they've had a number of master students also do analyses. This figure is from my final report from my Rutherford Discovery Fellowship. So things have moved on a little bit now, but I think I just like the way it shows the different types of activities and all the different people involved in that project. I want to sort of change gears a little bit now and talk about the non-tree or the broader kind of biodiversity and climate change work that I've done as well. And so I've had a number of contributions that have involved large groups of people and thinking about global patterns and syntheses. These 2 photographs are from the tree mortality workshops. The first was in Jena in 2014 and the second was in Hanover in 2017. This palace is owned by the Volkswagen Foundation, and they just have people churning through going to conferences. If you ever get the opportunity to go to one of the Volkswagen workshops, it's an amazing palace to visit. So warmly recommend going there. It was really interesting being in this sumptuous palace and then talking about tree mortality. It felt very unusual. But these kinds of contributions are a great way to kind of think about, what are the global patterns, what are the things we should be looking out for, how can we improve funding and making connections and understanding different approaches. So been really fortunate to be involved in a number of papers in that way. And some of these other ones too are sort of global databases where we put all the data together from different places around the world to understand what the patterns are. And when our field-based work takes so much work, it's really nice to be able to have the data used in different ways. So sharing the data and making more use of it to understand global patterns is a really a great thing. And I've also had some great contributions around workshops and transdisciplinary type approaches. And I wanted to thank Margaret Stanley, but she can't be here this evening, but she sort of first introduced me to these kinds of activities with a paper from 2015 that looked at the potential issues on the horizon for urban ecology. So we used a workshop type approach to kind of think about what the future issues might be and produced a nice paper out of that. And so that kind of type of approach is a really great way to figure out what the main issues are. And this is another example here that I led from 2016 there, but actually the paper didn't come out till this one here, 2021. So, oops, 5 years between the workshop and the paper. But what we did show in this workshop, so we're across lots of different disciplines. So transdisciplinary type approaches are important for thinking about, what do we all think is different? How can we make a consensus is basically the approach that we had here. And this workshop was so interesting because we started off thinking about what are the main questions we need to think about for climate change and biodiversity. And we realised that in fact that was going to be really difficult to agree on, but what we could agree on was that climate change impacts in Aotearoa are predominantly indirect and exacerbating other threats rather than being sort of really direct and easy to measure. So this kind of exacerbation of existing conservation threats became the paper that we produced. And that's been really highly cited because it's really showing the concept here in Aotearoa, but it's also applicable to island systems around the world, we think. And then also part of that, we produced a more comprehensive review of climate change in Aotearoa impacts on biodiversity. And from those ones, it's been great because I've done some consulting with or advising with the Ministry for Environment and other kinds of activities, also contributing to the IPCC, because I developed, we developed the knowledge around, bringing all that together and thinking about what needs to be done. There's a whole lot more that needs to be done in that space, obviously, so there'll be more workshops to come, I'm sure. And then I wanted to talk about these things that I call side projects, but in fact, many of these are the things that I'm most proud of. They're not kind of my main line of work, but often it's students' projects that have sort of taken me off into those different spaces. But the one I really want to highlight is this piece with Tara and Dan Hikaroa, which is all about thinking about bringing together science and Indigenous knowledge in ways that are appropriate and developing relationships that are enduring and mutually beneficial. So where to next? I will be still working on drought, and we know that there's many other species besides kauri that are responsive to drought. So these are some photographs from that 2020 period. As soon as we got out of lockdown, I was out having a look around and seeing what was going on. And so there's a whole lot more that we don't know. But I'm also thinking about some other stuff. So climate change is not just about drought, and in fact we know that temperature is obviously one of the other big ones. And so this is for Tamaki, the stripes. And as you'll all know, those redder stripes are those times when it's getting hotter and hotter. So thinking about what the impact of heat will be on plants is a new direction that I want to take. Also thinking about how we can do plant physiology in a more culturally sensitive way. Plant physiologists are quite happy to kind of kill plants without thinking about it too much. But should we be thinking about ethics of working with plants as physiologists? How should we better treat plants, particularly when they're culturally important? And then I also want to acknowledge my collaborator, Professor Casey Barton from the University of Hawaii. We've started a project together looking at heteroblasty and what that might mean for climate change. So we're thinking about the species that have quite different forms as juvenile and mature plants. These plants can look so different as juvenile and mature that sometimes they don't even look like the same species. So we want to understand whether either the juvenile or mature form might be more or less vulnerable to climate change, because nobody's really thinking about that. And so I've just really enjoyed having a project that's all of my own to do with Casey, so that's been cool. But of course, I do need to acknowledge my students. I haven't really talked much about student work at all, because I want my students to have their own work, their work as their own, I guess. And I would say, though, that working with emerging researchers is one of the real privileges of this job. So I put this together and I thought, oh, that looks a bit like the credits at the end of a movie. But I just feel really blessed to have had such a wonderful group of students and some excellent ones ongoing. But I guess I just wanted to finish with a bit of a tribute to some of the people. It's not a complete thing. It took me ages to put this together, and of course didn't get everyone. But yeah, thanks to everyone who I've worked with, and thank you all for being here this evening.